The letter my grandmother wrote before she disappeared. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. For 30 years, my family told a single, polished lie about the night the rain washed my grandmother away. They said Clara was a fragile woman. They said her mind was a labyrinth of paranoia and shadow, and that one stormy November evening in 1996, she simply wandered off into the dark, unable to cope with the pressure of a wealthy suburban life. My father, Thomas, was the primary architect of this narrative. He would sit in his immaculate, oppressive living room, swirl the scotch in his heavy crystal glass, and speak of her with a chilling mixture of pity and quiet disdain. She was broken long before she left us. Victor, he would say, his authoritative voice leaving no room for questions. But you start pulling at a thread in your family tree, and you never know whose neck it's tied around. I believed the myth because it was easier than the alternative. That changed last Tuesday. My grandfather had recently passed away, leaving his sprawling, drafty house to be emptied. I was tasked with clearing out the attic, a claustrophobic space choked with dust motes and the musty scent of forgotten decades. I was sorting through a cedar trunk, cataloging moth-eaten garments, when my hand brushed against a heavy wool coat. It was Clara's. The fabric was coarse, smelling faintly of old lavender and damp earth. As I lifted it to fold it into a donation box, the weight felt wrong, uneven. I ran my fingers along the heavy hemline and felt the unmistakable crinkle of paper hidden beneath the dark fabric. The stitching was clumsy, clearly done in a panicked rush. My pulse thickened in my throat as I retrieved my pocket knife. I slid the blade through the brittle thread, slicing the lining open. A folded piece of stationery slipped out, yellowed and stiff. The ink had faded to a bruised purple, but the frantic, jagged handwriting was entirely legible. It was dated November 14th, 1996, the exact night she vanished. I unfolded the brittle paper, my breath catching in the stifling attic air as I read the chilling opening line. The first terrified sentence proved she never actually ran away from our family. The official story was practically a gospel in our town. Clara was mentally unstable, leaving behind a devastated husband and an incredibly stoic, responsible son, my father. Thomas wore that tragedy like a badge of honor, cultivating a reputation as the man who held the family together when the matriarch abandoned them. He built his local real estate empire on that foundation of sympathy and supposed resilience. He controlled the narrative so perfectly that no one ever dared to look beneath the floorboards. I was 10 when she vanished, just old enough to remember the deafening silence that settled over our house, and the way my father's eyes would darken if her name was ever spoken. Standing there in the suffocating heat of the attic, the dust clinging to my sweat, I stared at the letter. My grandmother was not a phantom who lost her mind. She was a woman who was acutely, terrifyingly aware of her surroundings. The letter did not contain the rambling thoughts of a broken psyche. It was a precise, calculated ledger of survival. She wrote about a specific safety deposit box at a regional bank 3 towns over, and a property deed no one in the family had ever mentioned. The paper smelled like fear and desperation, the kind that seeps into your pores. She detailed the exact time she planned to leave the house, calculating the window when my grandfather and my father would be occupied. There was no mention of mental fog, no apologies for her absence. There were only instructions, names, and a chilling warning about the men in her own house. I read the paragraphs again, tracing the frantic indentations her pen had made in the heavy paper, realizing how deeply I had been deceived. The foundation of my entire life was built on a calculated, malicious deception. The paper trembled in my hands as the full weight of the 30-year-old lie began to settle firmly over me. I immediately had to know what my father was desperately trying to hide. The silence of the attic was suddenly broken by the sound of rain lashing against the small window pane, pulling me back to the present. The letter felt heavy in my hands, a physical manifestation of a ghost demanding to be heard. I scanned the middle section of the page, my eyes locking onto a specific address written in the margins. It was a rural route out in the heavy timber country, miles away from the manicured lawns of our suburban neighborhood. Next to it was an account number for a bank that had been absorbed by a larger conglomerate over a decade ago. This contradicted everything. According to Thomas, She left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few $100s from the household safe. Yet here was undeniable proof of premeditation, of hidden assets, and a secret sanctuary. Why would a supposedly delusional woman secure a secondary property under a maiden name? The paranoia began to creep in, a cold draft winding its way down my spine. If my father had lied about her mental state and her departure, what else was a fabrication? I carefully folded the brittle paper and slid it into my breast pocket, suddenly feeling entirely exposed in my own family's house. I needed to test the waters, to see just how deep the deception ran. The next evening, I sat across from Thomas in his oppressive living room, the grandfather clock ticking like a metronome counting down to a detonation. He was nursing his usual scotch, pontificating about local zoning laws. I waited for a lull in his monologue, taking a slow sip of my water, my heart hammering against my ribs. I casually mentioned the name of the old bank listed in Clara's letter, pretending I had stumbled across it in some old estate paperwork. The sudden, violent shift in his entire demeanor told me absolutely everything immediately. My father did not simply pause, he froze entirely. The heavy crystal glass stopped halfway to his mouth, his knuckles turning a stark, translucent white. For a long, agonizing second, the authoritative, polished mask slipped, revealing something raw and distinctly predatory beneath. "Where did you hear that name, Victor?" His voice was barely a whisper, yet it filled the room with an aggressive, suffocating pressure. I feigned nonchalance, forcing my shoulders to relax, claiming it was just a discarded piece of mail mixed in with grandfather's utility bills. Thomas set his glass down on the mahogany table with a sharp, definitive clack that made me flinch. "You are wasting your time digging through garbage," he snapped, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "Your grandmother was a sick woman who made her own choices. We moved on. I suggest you do the same, permanently." He stood abruptly, the conversation clearly terminated. The hostility was so entirely out of proportion to a simple question about an obsolete bank that it confirmed every terrible suspicion the letter had raised. He wasn't just protective of his mother's memory. He was actively guarding a perimeter. I left his house that night with the distinct sensation of being watched. The following morning, I knew I could not navigate this labyrinth alone. I needed an outsider, someone who knew the players but wasn't bound by the family's toxic loyalty. I spent hours digging through digital microfilms of local newspapers from November 1996, scanning the brief, dismissive articles about the missing suburban housewife. At the bottom of a buried paragraph, I found the name I was looking for. Detective Arthur Russo was the lead investigator before the case was abruptly and quietly shuttered. Tracking him down to a modest retirement community across the county took less than a day. The retired detective had been waiting 3 long decades for someone to finally ask. Detective Russo lived in a small, stale-smelling apartment cluttered with model ships and fading photographs. He was in his late 70s now, his eyes clouded with cataracts, but his mind remained terrifyingly sharp. When I introduced myself as Clara's grandson, he didn't offer condolences or pleasantries. He simply gestured to a worn armchair and poured 2 cups of bitter, black coffee. "I knew one day the polished veneer of your family would finally crack," Russo muttered, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. He explained, with a slow, methodical precision, how the initial investigation into my grandmother's disappearance had been systematically derailed. According to Russo, there were inconsistencies from the very first night. Clara hadn't taken her medication, but she had taken her passport. There were tire tracks in the mud near the back gate that didn't match the family vehicles. But every time Russo tried to pull at a thread, he hit a solid brick wall constructed by my father. "Thomas wasn't a grieving son," Russo said, his raspy voice echoing in the cramped room. "He was a crisis manager. He lawyered up before we even issued a public plea. He used his connections with the mayor's office to throttle our resources." Russo leaned in closer, the smell of stale tobacco and peppermints washing over me. He confessed that he was forced to close the file citing lack of evidence of foul play, officially ruling it a voluntary disappearance. "Your old man made sure nobody looked too closely at the family finances right before she vanished," Russo added, tapping a thick, arthritic finger against the table. "You start digging there, Victor, and you better be ready for whatever crawls out." I left Russo's apartment with a cold, heavy knot in my stomach. knowing my father had orchestrated a massive cover-up. I absolutely had to follow the dark paper trail before he realized I knew. The sterile, fluorescent-lit archives of the county clerk's office felt miles away from the damp, emotional weight of the attic. I spent the next 3 days calling in sick to work, burying myself in property deeds, tax records, and microfiche spools. I felt less like a grieving grandson and more like a forensic accountant hunting a ghost. I cross-referenced the rural address from Clara's letter with property transfers from the late 90s. It was a painstaking, methodical process, scrolling through hundreds of blurry black and white documents until my eyes burned. Finally, on a roll of film dated August 1996, just 3 months before she vanished, I found it. A deed of sale for a remote cabin on 20 acres of dense timberland. The purchaser was listed as C. Vance, utilizing my grandmother's maiden name, a detail nobody outside the immediate family would ever connect. The purchase was made entirely in cash, bypassing any mortgage lenders who might ask uncomfortable questions. This was her sanctuary. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She had been quietly siphoning funds, planning her escape with a meticulous desperation that entirely shattered my father's narrative of sudden mental collapse. She wasn't wandering aimlessly into the night. She had a specific, fortified destination. I printed the deed, the smell of warm toner mixing with the stale air of the library. As I gathered my notes, a disturbing thought crept into my mind. If she had this cabin prepared, why didn't the police ever find her there? Did she never make it? Or did someone else find out about her sanctuary before she could safely disappear? I packed the copies into my briefcase, resolving to drive out to the property the very next morning to see what remained. When I returned to my apartment, I knew instantly I was no longer alone. The moment I unlocked my front door, a deep, primal alarm triggered in my brain. The air inside my apartment felt disturbed, heavy with an unfamiliar presence. I am a creature of strict habit. My keys always go on the brass hook, my shoes aligned parallel to the mat. The shoes were slightly skewed. I walked slowly into the kitchen, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my temples. The notepad where I had jotted down the bank routing number and the county clerk's operating hours had been shifted roughly 2 inches to the left. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible violation, but it screamed of quiet intimidation. Nothing of monetary value was missing. My laptop sat untouched on the counter, but the screen was open to an angle I never used. Someone had been inside, meticulously going through my life, looking for the very threads I was pulling. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the sudden vibration making me jump. It was a text message from Thomas. Heard you called in sick all week. Take care of your health, Victor. Some stones are better left unturned. Dinner on Sunday. The message was perfectly polite on the surface, but underneath, it was a glaring, unmistakable threat. He knew I was digging. He knew I was getting closer to the perimeter he had spent 30 years defending. The paranoia Russo had warned me about was now a suffocating reality. I checked the deadbolts, closed all the blinds, and sat in the dark living room with Clara's letter pressed flat against the coffee table. My father was no longer just an antagonist in a historical family drama. He was an active, dangerous obstacle. He thought the break-in would scare me into submission, forcing me back into the comfortable lie. He severely underestimated exactly how much of his own relentless, stubborn blood I possessed. The drive out to the timber country was a tense, atmospheric journey through walls of dense, dripping pine trees. The rain had returned, slicking the winding, poorly maintained rural roads and matching the dark, churning dread in my stomach. The address led me to a rusted, chained gate practically swallowed by overgrown blackberry brambles. I parked my car out of sight behind a thicket, grabbed a heavy flashlight and a crowbar from the trunk, and hiked the remaining half-mile up the muddy incline. The cabin emerged through the fog like a rotting wooden skeleton. It was small, unassuming, and clearly abandoned for decades. The roof sagged heavily under a thick carpet of wet moss, and the windows were opaque with years of grime. I used the crowbar to pry open the swollen front door, the wood groaning and splintering loudly in the eerie silence of the woods. The inside smelled overwhelmingly of mildew and decaying leaves. I swept my flashlight beam across the single, shadowy room. It was sparsely furnished, a simple iron bed frame, a potbelly stove, and a wooden table. But as I moved closer, my heart stopped. Resting on the dusty table was a tarnished silver hairbrush and a faded, mold-spotted ceramic mug. They were hers. Physical, undeniable proof that Clara had made it here that night. I walked slowly through the debris, my breath visible in the damp chill, documenting everything with my phone's camera. She had reached her sanctuary. The narrative that she wandered into the river and drowned near the suburbs was completely annihilated. I knelt beside the iron bed, my flashlight catching a slight, unnatural elevation in the wide wooden floorboards beneath it. The rotten floorboard was completely loose, concealing a dark, hollowed-out cavity hidden directly underneath. I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the elevated floorboard, applying heavy pressure until the rusted nails shrieked and gave way. Beneath the damp wood, resting in a bed of dry dirt, was a heavy steel lockbox. It was caked in grime and rust, undisturbed since the late 90s. My hands shook violently as I hauled it out, the metal freezing against my skin. I used the crowbar again, violently breaking the flimsy latch. I fully expected to find stacks of cash, the hidden fortune Clara had siphoned away to fund her new life. Instead, the box was crammed entirely with densely typed legal documents, ledger copies, and audio cassette tapes. I pulled out a stack of papers protected by a thick plastic sleeve. As I scanned the fading text in the beam of my flashlight, the true horror of my family's legacy crystallized. These weren't Clara's secrets, they were Thomas's. They were internal audits from his early real estate ventures, detailing massive, systematic fraud, extortion, and the aggressive laundering of money through local construction unions. There were forged signatures, phantom contractors, and explicit evidence that my father had bribed local officials to fast-track zoning permits. Clara hadn't just discovered his crimes. She had meticulously documented them. The letter in the coat wasn't just a goodbye. It was a map to the murder weapon. My father wasn't protecting a fragile mother. He was terrorized by a whistleblower. If these documents had seen the light of day 30 years ago, Thomas would have spent his entire life in federal prison. The perfect family empire was built entirely on stolen money and silenced voices. The absolute realization that my father was capable of anything completely and utterly paralyzed me. I sat on the rotting floor of the cabin for hours, surrounded by the damning evidence of my father's massive criminal enterprise. The moral weight of the lockbox pressed down on my chest like an anvil. I was holding the exact mechanism that would entirely destroy my own family. Releasing these documents wouldn't just ruin Thomas. It would bankrupt the estate, void the trusts, and shatter the lives of relatives who had unknowingly lived on blood money for 3 decades. The dilemma was agonizing. I was essentially being asked to detonate a bomb in my own living room to avenge a ghost. But as I looked at Clara's silver hairbrush sitting abandoned on the table, a cold, hard clarity washed over me. She had sat in this freezing cabin, terrified, clutching these papers, waiting for a chance to expose the monster her son had become. And he had found her first. The fact that the lockbox was still here meant she never got the chance to use it. Whatever happened next, Thomas had ensured her permanent silence. To bury these documents now would be to participate in her murder, making me just as complicit as the corrupt local police. I carefully packed the ledgers, the documents, and the cassette tapes into my heavy canvas backpack, leaving the cabin exactly as I found it. I drove back to the city with a terrifying, singular focus. I was no longer a confused grandson looking for closure. I was the executioner, and the trial was long overdue. I needed to corner Thomas in an environment where he could not run, manipulate, or use his wealth to escape the incoming devastation. I finally picked up my cell phone and formally accepted his threatening invitation for dinner. The preparation for Sunday dinner felt less like arranging a family gathering and more like meticulously setting a lethal trap. I did not go to Thomas's house. Instead, I insisted he come to my apartment. I told him I had found some old family albums in the attic and wanted to reminisce, playing perfectly into the docile, obedient son routine he expected. I spent the entire afternoon transforming my living room into an inescapable interrogation chamber. I cleared the dining table entirely. In the center, I placed the rusted steel lockbox, perfectly illuminated by the overhead pendant light. Around it, I carefully arranged the most damning pieces of evidence. The forged construction ledgers, the records of bribes paid to city officials, and the deed to the hidden cabin. Right at the head of the table, where Thomas would sit, I placed Clara's original handwritten letter, still smelling faintly of old lavender and desperation. I synced the audio cassette recordings to my laptop, routing the sound through a heavy Bluetooth speaker hidden on the bookshelf. Every angle was covered. There was no room for gaslighting, no space for his authoritative bellowing to drown out the physical proof. I was sick to my stomach, my hands clammy with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. I was about to look into the eyes of the man who raised me and accuse him of the ultimate betrayal. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy, authoritative knock echoed through my apartment. I took one final, deep breath, centering myself in the quiet dread of the room. I slowly opened the front door and formally welcomed the absolute monster into my home. Thomas stepped into the entryway, shaking the evening rain from his expensive tailored overcoat. He carried a bottle of aged wine, his face arranged in an expression of cautious, patronizing warmth. "Victor," he said, his voice smooth and commanding, "I hope you've stopped chasing ghosts." He walked past me toward the dining room, entirely unprepared for the massacre waiting for him. The moment he saw the table, he stopped dead. The wine bottle slipped from his grasp, shattering against the hardwood floor, a dark red stain rapidly spreading across the oak like a fresh wound. He stared at the rusted lockbox, then at the meticulously arranged ledgers, his face draining of all color until it matched the pale parchment of Clara's letter. For a full minute, the only sound in the apartment was the heavy, ragged sound of his breathing. The authoritative, untouchable mask didn't just slip. It violently shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave into a raw, guttural growl. He lunged toward the table to grab the papers, but I stepped sharply into his path, my posture rigid. "She didn't wander off, Thomas," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the terror inside me. "She ran from you. She was going to hand you over to the federal authorities." I hit a key on my laptop, and the scratchy, undeniable audio of Thomas arranging a massive bribe filled the room. He stumbled backward, collapsing heavily into a dining chair, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a cornered animal realizing the trap had fully sprung. The impenetrable fortress of his 30-year lie was rapidly and violently burning to the ground. "You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with," Thomas hissed, his hands trembling violently as he gestured toward the devastating paperwork. "I built this family. I provided everything. She was going to destroy our entire legacy over a few administrative shortcuts." His desperation was pathetic, attempting to reframe massive, systematic extortion as mere bureaucratic errors. I leaned across the table, my face inches from his, the anger finally burning through my disciplined facade. "She was your mother. She ran to that cabin because she was terrified of her own son." Thomas let out a hollow, manic laugh that sent a sharp chill directly down my spine. "The cabin," he whispered, staring blankly at the wood grain of the table. "She was so incredibly naive. She thought paying in cash would hide her." The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. I hadn't explicitly mentioned the cabin to him. I stared at him, the horrifying realization clicking into place. "You knew she made it there," I said, my voice dropping to a horrified whisper. Cornered by the undeniable paper trail, his exhaustion finally overtook his deception. He slumped in the chair, running a trembling hand over his face, looking suddenly like a very old, very broken man. "I followed her that night," Thomas confessed, his voice devoid of any emotion, empty and dead. "I couldn't let her get to a phone. I just wanted to take the documents back. Victor, I swear to God." The suffocating silence that followed his terrifying confession was the absolute loudest sound I've ever heard. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. I did not let Thomas leave my apartment that night. I dialed Detective Russo first, then the local authorities. When the police arrived, Thomas didn't resist. He sat at the dining table, staring at Clara's letter, entirely broken by the ghosts he thought he had successfully buried. The scandal detonated across our quiet suburban town with the force of a localized earthquake. The local news cycle was dominated by the unearthing of a 30-year-old cold case and the spectacular, public collapse of a prominent real estate mogul. The authorities eventually searched the dense woods located directly behind the hidden cabin. Using ground-penetrating radar, They found Clara's remains buried shallowly near a grove of ancient pines, exactly where her own son had left her in the freezing rain 3 decades ago. The legal implications for the family estate were catastrophic. Assets were frozen, properties were seized by federal investigators, and the fortune built on blood and bribery evaporated practically overnight. Relatives who had happily ignored the dark shadows of Thomas's empire suddenly found themselves ostracized and bankrupt. I was not immune to the fallout. The process was exhausting, dragging me through endless depositions, police interviews, and the agonizing glare of the public eye. My own family fractured completely, some blaming me for destroying the legacy rather than blaming the man who committed the atrocities. But as I watched Thomas led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit replaced by a stark orange jumpsuit, I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of justice. The dark venom that had secretly poisoned our bloodline for decades was finally being violently extracted. 6 months after the arrest, I stood on a quiet, windswept hill overlooking the local cemetery. The sky was the color of bruised slate, threatening rain, but the air felt remarkably clean and light. I had arranged for Clara to be properly interred, far away from the imposing, ostentatious family mausoleum that Thomas had built with dirty money. Her new headstone was simple, elegant, and bore her true name without any qualifiers. The illusion of my perfect family was entirely gone, replaced by the ugly, undeniable truth of generational trauma and the devastating cost of burying secrets. It is terrifying to realize that the monsters we read about aren't always strangers hiding in the dark. Sometimes they are the people pouring our coffee and paying our tuition. I lost my inheritance, my privacy, and the comfortable lie I had lived for 40 years. But standing there in the cold wind, listening to the rustle of the dry leaves, I finally felt the heavy, suffocating weight lift from my shoulders. The ghosts of the past no longer haunted the dusty corners of my life. By refusing to look away, by choosing the agonizing truth over the comfortable deception, I had finally given my grandmother the voice she was brutally denied. She didn't abandon us. She fought for us until her dying breath. I placed a single white rose on the damp earth above her grave, turned my collar up against the gathering chill, and walked slowly back to my car. The buried truth will always eventually manage to violently dig its way out of the dark earth.